takes a very small amount of virus to establish an infection in a house as well. That's the critical piece, is that it takes such a small quantity of virus to cause basically a cycle or an upscaling of that virus production in the house, leading to, unfortunately, the events that we see now in this country.
Hello and welcome to the Poultry Edge with me, Rebecca Tierney. In this episode we will talk to poultry veterinary practitioner Aonghus Lane from St David's Poultry Veterinary team here in Ireland about biosecurity in relation to avian influenza, more commonly referred to as bird flu. At the time of recording, there has been 3 confirmed cases of AI in Ireland. Aonghus, thank you for joining us today. Biosecurity is hugely important at any stage in poultry production. However, during this avian influenza high-risk period, it cannot be understated just how crucial it is. Can you give us a definition as to what biosecurity means for poultry producers?
Biosecurity, I guess, is a set of practices that we carry out on farm and throughout poultry enterprises to ensure that there is no introduction of disease into and onto farms, and also that we don't take disease off farms. In reality, whenever we're talking about biosecurity, we should always judge it from the perspective of the bird. We're always trying to protect that bird. We're trying to prevent the introduction of disease into that bird house or into that bird area. But likewise, if we know that there is a known disease challenge in that house, we're trying to keep it in there and not bring it out. It's an important piece to consider, because a lot of the time people can get very hung up on, what's going on outside the birdhouse. And while outside the birdhouse is a very important part of the biosecurity chain, a lot of the time those crucial steps that the farmers take entering into the bird area are often not done correctly or incomplete. And that can be that critical point of introduction into our birdhouses.
Obviously, we're in a high-risk avian influenza season. What is avian influenza, or it's more commonly known bird flu? What symptoms should our producers be looking out for? How does bird flu come to our shores here on the island of Ireland? And what should a producer or poultry keeper do if they do suspect bird flu?
What is bird flu? What is avian influenza? It's basically a virus. It's an influenza virus. So typically it can be broken down into either highly pathogenic avian influenza or low pathogenic avian influenza. And how that is differentiated is typically through the actual defining of the different types or variants of avian influenza. So the H5 the H5 and the H7s are typically high pathogenic, although you can have low pathogenic forms within those. And outside of that, we tend not to see high path in the other H's and N's. Now, the H and N's refer to the actual external surface proteins of the virus, and they give the virus different, characteristics and the ability to infect different types of species and animals, as well as the ability to cause significant disease levels, as well as we see with the high path avian influenza. From the point of view of high path avian influenza, the typical clinical signs that will be seen will be, firstly, quite an acute, meaning rapid onset mortality or death in the birds. But prior to that, or even coinciding with that mortality, there are also other things that we can see. So there can be a change in behaviour. So a lot of the time it can be described that the bird become very quiet and lethargic. You can see issues such as neurological disorders, where you have birds that are showing signs of tremor, maybe straining of their neck, difficulty in walking. There can be digestive upset, where we see issues relating to diarrhea or watery bowel movements in the birds. As well as that, one of the pieces, if we look up about avian influenza on the internet, you can see blue discoloration of the heads and the legs. And that's typically how the virus interacts with the actual blood vessels in the bird, causing rupture and damage to the blood vessels. So typically what we can see is a blue discoloration of the legs or in certain parts of the body. And outside of that, as it is an influenza virus, it has been known to cause respiratory symptoms as well. They're not always a key component of the clinical presentation. Additionally, you can see reductions or drops in feed and water intakes, potentially production drops as well. But the primary piece that is typically seen is that mortality piece as well. So it is. The current type of avian influenza that we're seeing predominantly in this part of the world is the H5N1 strain of high pat avian influenza. And that typically finds itself in a reservoir in migratory birds, so typically waterfowl, but other types of migratory birds, and that is how it travels around the continent and around the globe as well. So that's how it comes to our shore. Now, whenever it comes to our shore, there is then a spillover into our native or usual bird or wild bird populations, and that then can be the introduction point into our commercial and backyard flocks. Now, there can be direct contact between the migratory birds and commercial poultry or backyard flocks of poultry, but typically we see it as a spillover effect, a spillover from migratory into wild birds, and then that further spillover or direct contact between our wild bird populations in Ireland. And in terms then of how it is spread around, it is typically then introduced into commercial or backyard flocks, as I say, either through direct contact, wild birds coming directly in contact with those types of poultry, or the bodily fluids or feces of those birds, or alternatively through secondary introduction, which is basically that it is being brought in on equipment, in on shoes, in on people's bodies, in on pieces of machinery that are being brought into poultry houses or poultry sheds, as well as then the ingress. So ingress of virus can happen as a result of water ingress, where we've had, severe storm damage to houses back earlier in 2025. If there is still damage to those houses, or where there is, a deterioration of the fabric of the houses, you can get, rainwater, you can get vermin, wild birds coming into houses as a result, and it takes a very small amount of virus to establish an infection in a house as well. That's the critical piece, is that it takes such a small quantity of virus to cause basically a cycle or an upscaling of that virus production in the house, leading to unfortunately the events that we see now in this country.
And then if a poultry producer is suspecting that they may have bird flu, what actions do they need to take?
We deal with, as a poultry veterinary practice, we deal with on a daily basis, different presentations of health and also mortality. And I guess it's our responsibility as a veterinary provider and a provider of poultry health advice to be able to basically understand the processes that are going on farm, to be able to decipher what we're being presented with, and also then through our investigation on farm determine what we are potentially looking at. Because while avian influenza is highly topical at the moment, there are many other reasons for mortality or sickness in poultry that we see every day. It should also be emphasised that if a poultry producer or backyard keeper is anyway suspicious at all of avian influenza, that high pat AI is a notifiable and legislated disease, meaning that there is a legal obligation to notify suspicion of avian influenza. So if there is suspicion, it should be notified. Typically, the routes that for commercial producers that notification will be made is typically through consultation with your poultry veterinary or your private veterinary practitioner or PVP, and also consultation with the department at that point as well.
What steps can our producers put in place to help prevent AI coming on site? I know we talked a little bit around the storm and things like that, but we have our housing order now in place as of Monday, November 10th, as directed by DAFAM. What other measures can producers do?
Whenever we're judging biosecurity, we need to judge it from the perspective of the bird. So you think of that bird inside in your poultry house or your poultry coop, and it's a case of thinking, well, how do I prevent something from getting in there? So there's going to be natural inputs: your feed, your water, your bedding. They're all absolute requirements to your birds. So it's ensuring that, number one, that they're sourced from an appropriate source. If it's a case that you are storing water on farm in tanks or whatever, ensuring that they're covered, that they're not exposed to the external environment, that there's no chance of vermin or birds getting into them or anything like that. Feed, making sure that it's stored correctly and appropriately on farm. And from the point of view of bedding material should not be stored out in the yard uncovered with bales left uncovered, because undoubtedly there will be birds in the yard and they will potentially pass feces onto those and then introduce them into the poultry house. So storing your bedding correctly. biosecurity. So if we look at from those as the inputs, that's what we need to have control over. Now, while we're talking about feed deliveries to farms, it's very important that through feed deliveries on farms that there's minimal spillage or no spillage at all. And if there is any spillage of feed, that it's picked up immediately. Whenever feed is being blown into feed bins on large commercial sites, there will be dust. And it's the case that dust should be collected. The most convenient way of doing that is through the installation of cyclones, which basically catch that dust. Or some people have come up with DIY solutions of, say, a 225-litre barrel filled with water just to the level below that actual blowpipe, and that will catch the dust, whatever it may be. But even if you don't have those remedies, that you are cleaning the yard down, you're gathering all that dust and potentially spilled feed up, because that will discourage wild birds, vermin, rodents coming onto the site, which could potentially bring disease. Whenever we pull away from those inputs into the house, then we need to focus on the actual people going in and out of houses. So no unnecessary visitors to your site, no unnecessary people going into the actual bird houses. If you as an individual are capable of doing the birds or looking after the birds on your own, then just you enter into the houses. Whenever you are going into the houses, ensuring that you're using foot dips, but you shouldn't be using foot dips unless what you're dipping in is clean. So washing your boots and then putting into foot dips. Now, foot dips need to have DAFM approved disinfectants, and they should be made up to the concentrations as per the manufacturer's guidelines, with a specific recommendation for avian influenza. So using your foot dips, then on entering into the house, using house-specific footwear or disposable PPE, which is thrown in the bin immediately after use. All farms should have step-over barriers, and step-over barriers are there as a reminder that we're at a point and we need to actually do something, so change our footwear. But it's also a case that it is creating barriers so that we are having basically safety margin between the outside, which is unknown, and the inside, the bird area, which is known. Also, things such as overalls, dust coats, making sure they're house specific. Washing, drying and sanitizing your hands. If you don't have hand washing facilities, you should really consider it. Not just from the point of avian influenza, but from the perspective of other diseases, such as gumbro, Campylobacter, Salmonella. But it is really important that is a consideration. And then also, equipment that you're bringing into the houses. If you can't clean it, do not bring it into the house. But also, don't share equipment between houses. Again, if you have to, wash it and disinfect it. But things like your dead buckets, they need to be washed if they go outside the house. Do not bring them back into the house if you've taken them out, unless you wash and disinfect them. In reality, dead buckets or buckets that are used for collecting carcasses or even baskets for collecting eggs should not be taken out of the actual house. So they shouldn't, because that is a great risk of introduction. And then also, if you're having people coming onto your site, like egg collection lorries, you're having catching teams coming on to collect your birds, it is important that the equipment that they are using is clean and disinfected. If you notice that, say, the forklift arrives on farm for depopulation and it's dirty, well, don't just stand there and say, well, it was dirty before it came here. You do need to provide a facility to wash it with soap, so detergent, and also disinfect it before it enters into your house. Because while you mightn't see it as your problem, it could very quickly become your problem, so it could. On top of that, the people that are coming with these teams, ensuring that they are adhering to biosecurity levels. And if it's the case that you're concerned around their biosecurity, then notify the foreman or notify the business that has them on your site as well. I mentioned about egg collection, but also for chick deliveries on farm. It's important to remember that these trolleys will typically come in contact with some part of the concrete apron around your houses. And a very important piece is that before they come, wash the area down and disinfect it so that you can be confident that you are putting steps in place to reduce the risk of incursion of disease onto your farms. And then also, if we take ourselves away from the birdhouse or to the actual perimeter around your poultry site. So you should have a poultry specific biosecure area, making sure that your gates are closed. If you don't have a gate and you use a chain, making sure the chain is up at all times. Discourage people from coming onto your site. Don't have your yard as a turning circle. Don't have your yard as a storage facility for other farm machinery, because all that will increase the risk of disease incursion onto your farm as well.
Simple measures, but it is just about creating good habit. If a poultry producer is unfortunate enough, as there has been in the country, What happens when there is a confirmed case of bird flu for both that site themselves and then the farms in that surrounding area?
So I guess we'll take it back very slightly. So we'll take it back to the point of notification of a concern. So at that point, there will be carried out a testing process on the farm, typically of the affected house or the house of suspicion, and all houses on the site will typically be tested as well. And at that point, the testing is carried out is a testing to exclude. So it's a testing to exclude avian influenza. So that will typically, it can take 24 to 48 hours for the tests to come back after they've left the site. And there will be birds sampled, and there will be carcasses taken off site as well for testing. And they will go to the state lab for the state veterinary lab for testing. If it comes back and the producer is unfortunate enough to have a confirmed case of avian influenza, and I should say at the point of notification, at the point of sampling, there's a restriction notice placed on that farm. So a restriction on the movement of birds on or off the site, the restriction on the movement of products, whether that be byproduct, waste product, or actual product for distribution. That's all stopped. No litter can be taken off site or anything like that. But if it comes back as a positive, then what happens is that site is regarded as an infected premises, and around that infected premises there's zones put in place. So you have the 3 kilometre protection zone and the 10 kilometre surveillance zone. Now if we stick with the farm for now, in Ireland and across most of the world, there's what's called a stamping out policy. So that means the destruction humanely of all poultry species on that physical site. So even if they're not infected and come back with a negative result, everything that is within that epidemiological unit, which is where there has been direct contact between the infected houses and non-infected houses, even if there's changes of footwear and everything, then there is a calling out process. And the quicker that that's done, in reality, the better from the point of view of dampening down that virus in the environment, but also from a bird welfare perspective too. So after that process has been completed, then that farm will go through the stages of cleaning and disinfection and downtime. But for the farms that are within the zones, it will have an impact on those farms. So the 3 kilometre and 10 kilometre zones, as I've said, those zones will have implications as to where product can go that has been produced on those zones, but it will also have an effect on the movement of waste products and byproducts from those farms. So if you just, from the point of view of bird movements, so any live bird movements out of the zone or even into the zone will need to be licensed. So if you are a producer or you have spent hens that are going to be going to the factory, those birds will have to be inspected by the Department of Agriculture veterinary team within 24 hours of movement for basically licenses to be issued. If it's a case that you've gone through the depopulation process and your birds have gone to the factory, these are the non-positive farms, they're just going to the factory into the food chain, the litter that's in those houses will have to be licensed off-site. Additionally, your dead bin collections, that will also need licensing, so it is. So this is an entire legal framework, and it's much more than what I'm discussing here, but these are the main pieces, so they are. But additionally, there's a legal requirement on visitor controls on the site. So no non-essential visitors to the site. Vets can come on site to carry out welfare visits if there's any sort of disease or health issues on the farm. But anybody that is coming onto your site, it is your requirement as the farmer, as the producer, as the poultry keeper to document visitors onto the site. So it is. Now, typically, after the primary cleaning and disinfection of the infected premises, 21 days or so after that has been completed, the protection zone will merge with the surveillance zone. So that 3K zone will be gotten rid of. It'll all be encompassed in that 10K zone. And then typically around 30 days after that completion of primary cleaning and disinfection, will the zones be removed. Now, if there is a subsequent case within the zone, then the timer or the clock basically goes back to zero and everything restarts before those zones start to merge and be gotten rid of as well. But it should be noted that, being in a zone is a very critical piece. So it is. You're not put in the zone just for the sake of it. You're put in the zone because that is an area of very high risk. It's not to say that other areas there isn't as great a risk. There absolutely is, but proximity to an infected premises is a risk factor for incursion of disease onto farm. So those farmers in those zones need to be very, very considerate of their biosecurity and movements on site. So they do.
A lot to consider there for those in that zone as well, just to really step up to the mark and listen to those symptoms that you've described. We hear a lot of talk, Aonghus, around vaccines being introduced for avian influenza. Is this something being looked at here for Irish poultry just yet?
At the moment, a quick answer would be no. It's definitely something that those involved in the poultry industry are aware of. And we're aware that many other countries are giving it quite a high level of consideration. I guess up until now, our last case of avian influenza in the Republic of Ireland, Rebecca, correct me if I'm wrong, was 2022 maybe? And not on the island of Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, I'd say. We have had cases in Northern Ireland, so we have, but in the Republic of Ireland, I believe that was the last confirmed case in the Republic of Ireland. So up until now, things have been pretty good, so they have. And so we haven't had these major waves that they've seen in, say, GB or in continental Europe over the last number of years. But it definitely is something that is gaining a lot of momentum. Unfortunately, there's a lot of potential mixed messaging around vaccination for avian influenza. And I think what will dominate in the next number of years will be the science piece. And I think the science piece will show that in some parts of the world, vaccination will be an absolute critical strategy for the control of avian influenza. But that can't happen alone. So we can't just vaccinate and forget about it. The biosecurity is still the primary focus, so it is. Vaccination is just a tool there to help reduce risk, but it definitely won't be the primary piece, so it won't. I guess the other challenge with avian influenza vaccines is that to be effective, typically they need a number of vaccinations. And for the likes of our shorter-lived broilers, yes, you might be able to give a vaccination in the hatchery, but will it be sufficient to provide coverage for that bird for that 35, 40-day life? I guess that's what the science will need to tell us. But for the longer lived birds, they will require a number of vaccines outside of that primary vaccination. And in addition to that, I guess, as with all vaccinations, whether it be in animals or in humans, it's not always going to be 100% successful. So it may dampen down clinical signs, it may dampen down the actual circulation of virus, but that's not to say birds won't get infected. So one of the key pieces of avian influenza vaccination, say for example, that has been carried out in the foie gras industry in France, has been sampling. And that sampling is basically to test birds to ensure that they are negative and not silent carriers of the virus. And that comes at a huge cost to government and industry to do that. So there's a lot of considerations. And we haven't even got into the piece on potential implications for entry into certain markets for poultry meat and poultry produce. But I don't think that's for this conversation today.
No, but it's certainly, as you said, it's not the silver bullet for protection against avian influenza. It is only a link in a longer chain of biosecurity measures. And finally, just for smaller backyard or artisanal producers that may be listening, is the housing order for these producers also?
Absolutely, Rebecca. The housing order is for all poultry keepers and poultry producers, so it is. And it's very important that we all consider this as our responsibility, whether we have 2 hens in our backyard or whether we have 100,000 broilers. It is a shared responsibility that we must all take on board. yes, I am a poultry vet working in the commercial poultry industry, but in a previous life, I was a backyard poultry keeper, and I know the frustrations associated with it. I know that you will have people breeding different types of fancy fowl out there that would love to be getting to their national shows and UK shows and everything like that. They would love to be getting their breeding pens set up and so on. But we just have to bear in mind that we all have a shared responsibility in trying to prevent disease incursion onto our premises, but also trying to reduce the risk of spread and multiplication of this environment, which will increase environmental pressures overall.
Thank you so much, Aonghus, for your time this morning.
No problem at all, Rebecca. I'm more than happy to help.
That's all for today's podcast. I want to reiterate Aonghus's messages around biosecurity. It is vital for the protection of our industry, your livelihood and our local communities. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and best wishes in this stressful time. For more information around biosecurity, go to teagasc.ie. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to rate, review and follow the Poultry Edge podcast wherever you get your podcasts.